oh no, the 16th largest bank failed. But nobody remembers why we are here. So let me remind you. Yep, Donald Trump. In 2018, Donald Trump rolled back some legislation that was put in place to make sure the country never suffered another financial crisis the same way it did during the mortgage meltdown. As we know, Obama came into office after the financial crisis, and he helped to repair the economy. One of the things that was put in place during his presidency was the Dodd-Frank Act. The Dodd-Frank Act was a Wall Street reform that was put in place to prevent the excessive risk-taking that led to the financial crisis in the first place. Now, let me be clear. Many financial institutions hated the Dodd-Frank Act. It was an 800-pages worth of regulations that were required by the bank. We're still working through them to this day. We're still implementing some of the changes because the changes were very expensive for banks. And banks have to put a lot of systems into place, hire a lot of compliance people, risk management people, auditing people, create a lot of policies because the regulations were very detailed and the guidance was very specific. So we have been managing through Dodd-Frank ever since it was put in place. However, when Trump got into office, he rolled back some of the regulatory requirements that the Dodd-Frank had. One of the ones that are, I feel, attributed to what happened at Silicon Valley Bank is the stress test. Let me explain. So within the Dodd-Frank, it said that any bank up to $50 billion does not have to do a stress test and perform that test yearly. But if a bank has more assets than $50 billion and up, you must perform a stress test and pass it. Donald Trump said, let's relax this regulation a little bit. And I'm going to say banks over $250 billion have to perform the stress test and pass it. Now, if you know what the asset sizes of the banks are in this country, there aren't a lot over 250 billion, maybe 10. I would have to look it up. So that means almost all the banks in the country now do not have to perform a stress test. What is a stress test? A stress test is an internal test that banking organizations do to see whether the bank has enough capital to manage itself through tough times. If the bank does the stress test and the performance is poor and it submits it to the regulators that the bank cannot perform the stress test, the bank kind of says, okay, since you don't have enough capital, you're not allowed to pay dividends and you're not allowed to do share buybacks. Who does that upset? Investors. You follow the money. Now that Donald Trump said, okay, banks up to 250 billion, knowing that most of the banks in this country are not over 250 billion. There's a few. I know PNC, BMO, not a lot. Citibank, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, like the big banks are over 250, but the rest of them are mostly all under 250 billion. So now you've got an entire country that's not testing to make sure that they have enough capital or assets in place in case there's a run on the banks. And what happened to Silicon Valley? A run on the bank. When a demand is made and the bank can't make it, it makes the bank collapse. All their consumers decided to start pulling their funds out because they saw the bank trying to raise money, not able to raise money, bought bonds that were not valuable. Consumer confidence went out the window and now they want their money. What does that do? Create a whole collapse of that financial institution. But let's take it back. If Donald Trump would not have removed the regulation for banks 50 billion and up, then that bank would have never overextended itself. That bank would have managed to keep stress testing every year. The feds would have seen that it wasn't meeting the guidelines of the stress test, and the feds would have swooped in and made that bank get recapitalized. So there's so many things. We always said nobody's going to see the damage that Trump did until years after he left. And now here we are.